She stood alone at the edge of the ballroom, a crystal glass of champagne growing warm in her hand. The music was lovely, the candlelight soft, but none of it reached her. Her husband, the Duke of Thornwood, stood 20 feet away with his back half-turned toward her, his dark head inclined toward Lady Cordelia Vance. The woman's laugh floated across the room like a melody he had chosen over the silence he gave his wife. Alara's smile remained in place because she had learned to wear it like armor, but her heart was a hollow, aching thing. She saw the glances, the slight tilts of feathered heads, and she heard the whisper that slipped from behind a marble pillar. Poor Duchess. He hasn't looked at her once tonight. It's as if she's invisible. Invisible. The word settled into her chest and stayed there. She had been the Duchess of Thornwood for nearly a year, and in that year she had learned that a title could be the loneliest sound in the world. She set her glass down on a passing tray, excused herself with quiet dignity, and walked out onto the terrace. The cool night air touched her cheeks, and only then did she let the ache rise into her throat. She did not cry. She had no tears left for a man who refused to see her. 6 months earlier she had been Alara Voss, the daughter of a baron with more pride than fortune. Her family had been invited to a house party at Lady Cordelia's country estate, a coveted gathering that promised to elevate their standing. On the second night, a diamond necklace belonging to their hostess vanished from her private chambers. By morning, whispers had turned to stares, and by noon the necklace was found tucked inside Alara's own valise. She had never touched it. She swore her innocence until her voice broke, but Lady Cordelia's tearful disappointment and the testimony of a maid who claimed to have seen Alara near the room were enough. No formal charges were pressed, but the stain spread faster than fire. Within a week, Alara was unmarriageable, her family's name dragged through every drawing room in London. Then the Duke of Thornwood arrived at her father's modest estate. Alaric Ashford was a man carved from winter, tall, severe, with eyes the color of storm clouds. He spoke few words. He offered marriage. Her father, bewildered but desperate, accepted. Alara stood in the corner of the parlor, her hands trembling, searching the Duke's face for some flicker of warmth. There was none. But she was grateful, desperately grateful, and in her innocence she believed that gratitude might one day grow into affection. She told herself that a man who would rescue her from ruin must have a heart beneath that cold exterior. She was wrong, or so she thought. Their wedding was a quiet affair. He did not smile at her. He did not hold her hand. That night she waited in her new chambers at Thornwood Hall, a vast, beautiful estate that felt more like a museum than a home. She wore a pale blue gown, her hair soft around her shoulders, her heart beating with nervous hope. She waited until the candles burned low and the fire faded to embers. He never came. In the morning, she learned he had slept in his study. The pattern was set. Every night she dined across a table long enough to feel like a continent, and every night he excused himself with a polite, distant nod. She began leaving small things for him, a pressed flower on his desk, a note with a line of poetry she thought he might like, a single rose from the garden. They vanished without acknowledgement. She might as well have been leaving offerings to a stone statue. One afternoon she gathered her courage and went to his study. The door was ajar. Inside she heard his voice, low and tired, and the lighter tones of his sister, Lady Margaret. Margaret had always been kind to Alara, her eyes holding a sympathy she never voiced aloud. Alara paused, her hand hovering over the wood, and then she heard words that cracked her clean in two. "You've done your duty, Alaric," Margaret said softly. "No one could fault you. But you cannot punish her forever for a scandal she didn't create." There was a long silence. Then the Duke's voice came, heavy and flat. "I have given her my name, my protection, and every comfort. I cannot give her what I do not have." Alara's hand fell to her side. She felt the blood drain from her face. He did not have affection for her. He had never wanted her. She was a duty, a burden wrapped in silk. She turned and walked away on legs that felt numb, and when she reached her room she sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall until the shadows grew long. That night she did not leave a flower. She did not write a note. The hope she had carried like a fragile candle finally flickered out. And something inside her began to change. The days that followed were quiet but seismic. Alara stopped seeking him out. She stopped lingering in hallways hoping to catch his eye. At breakfast, she answered his brief questions with polite, empty words and then excused herself. She no longer asked about his day or shared small stories of her own. She began to fill her hours with purpose elsewhere. Thornwood Hall had a neglected estate village, a cluster of cottages where tenants struggled with a poor harvest. Alara started visiting, bringing baskets of food and asking gentle questions. She learned names, listened to troubles, and began working with Mr. Callum, the Duke's steward, to arrange relief. Callum was a quiet, kind man with sandy hair and a patient smile. He treated her with a respect that felt like water to parched soil. He never looked through her. He saw her. At first, Alaric noticed nothing. He was accustomed to her absence because he had trained himself not to look for her, but small things began to prick at the edges of his awareness. The fresh flowers on his desk stopped appearing. The faint scent of her perfume no longer lingered in the morning room. When he passed the library, he no longer saw her curled in the window seat with a book. The silence in the house grew deeper, and for reasons he could not name, it unsettled him. One evening he returned from a ride to find her in the garden with Callum. They were standing near the rose trellis and she was laughing. The sound struck him like a physical blow. He had never heard her laugh like that, not once in all the months of their marriage. Her face was turned up to the sunlight, her cheeks flushed with amusement, and Callum was smiling at her with an ease that made Alaric's chest tighten. He stood frozen at the edge of the lawn, and a dark, unwelcome emotion slithered through him. Jealousy. He recoiled from it, but it clung to him. He went inside and said nothing, but that night he found himself watching her across the dinner table. She did not notice. Her gaze was distant, serene, as if he were merely a fixture in the room. The realization cut deeper than he expected. Days passed, and he began to seek her out in small, clumsy ways. He appeared in the library when she was reading and asked a meaningless question about household accounts. She answered politely, her eyes never leaving her book. He invited her to walk with him through the East Gardens. She agreed, but the silence between them was filled with all the words she no longer tried to bridge. She walked beside him like a graceful ghost, and he found himself longing for the eager, hopeful woman who used to leave him roses. That woman was gone. He had killed her with his coldness, and the guilt began to gnaw at him. The turning point came when Lord Edward Sterling arrived for a visit. Edward was an old family friend, charming and warm, with a boyish grin that made people trust him instantly. He and Alara had known each other as children, and when he saw her in the drawing room, he greeted her with genuine delight. "Alara, you look wonderful. The country air suits you." She smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind she had not given Alaric in months. The Duke stood by the fireplace, watching the easy flow of conversation between them, and the jealousy he had felt in the garden returned tenfold. Edward teased her about a childhood mishap, and she laughed again, that bright, unguarded laugh. Alaric's jaw tightened. He felt invisible in his own home. That evening he found himself unable to sleep. He paced the study, replaying the sound of her laughter directed at another man. His mind conjured images of her leaving Thornwood, finding happiness elsewhere, forgetting him entirely. The fear was irrational but overpowering. He realized with sudden, terrifying clarity that he could not bear a life without her quiet presence. He had grown accustomed to it the way a man grows accustomed to breathing. And now that she was slipping away, he was suffocating. The next day, Alara requested a private word with him. She stood in the doorway of his study, her posture straight, her expression calm. "I would like to visit my mother," she said. "She has been unwell, and I think an extended stay would benefit us both. I may be gone several months." Alaric's heart stopped. Several months, an indefinite retreat. She was leaving him. The words "benefit us both" hung in the air like an indictment. He stared at her, his mask of composure cracking. "No," he said, his voice rough. "I cannot allow it." She blinked, clearly taken aback. "I was not asking permission, Your Grace. I was informing you." He crossed the room before he could stop himself, his hands trembling. "Alara, please do not go." She looked at him with a mixture of confusion and exhaustion. Why does it matter to you now? For a year I have been invisible to you. You married me out of duty. You made that abundantly clear. I have finally accepted it. Why can you not let me find some peace?" Her voice broke on the last word, and the sound shattered him. He reached for her hand, and she flinched. That small movement undid him completely. "Because I love you," he said, the words tearing out of him like a confession he had buried too deep for too long. "I have loved you since the first moment I saw you, long before the scandal, long before any of this. I was a coward. I was a fool. I thought you could never want me, so I locked my heart away and I punished you for my own fear. But I cannot lose you. I cannot." Alara stared at him, her lips parted, her eyes swimming with disbelief. The room was so silent she could hear the frantic beat of her own heart. "You love me," she whispered. "All this time you let me believe I was nothing more than an obligation. You let me drown in loneliness while you kept your secret. How could you be so cruel?" He lowered his head, his shoulders shaking. "I was terrified. I thought if I let you close, you would see how unworthy I was and you would hate me even more. I trapped you in this marriage. I knew I had no right to your affection. So I hid behind duty and distance, and I broke you in the process. I know I do not deserve your forgiveness, but you need to know the truth." She pulled her hand away and stepped back, her chest heaving. "I need time," she said, her voice raw. "I need to think." She left him standing alone in the study, his confession hanging in the air like a prayer he was not sure she would ever answer. Alara spent the next 2 days in a fog of confusion. Part of her wanted to believe him. The other part was too wounded to trust. She wandered the estate, avoiding him, her mind a storm of past hurts and new revelations. On the second afternoon, she found herself in his study while he was out riding. She did not know what drew her there, perhaps a need to understand him better, to find some missing piece. She opened drawers, looked at ledgers, and then her fingers brushed a small, hidden compartment at the back of his desk. Inside were letters, old and creased. Her hands trembled as she unfolded them. One was a letter from a woman named Agnes, a maid in Lady Cordelia's household, written in a shaky hand. It confessed that Lady Cordelia had ordered her to plant the diamond necklace in Alara's luggage, because Cordelia was desperate to remove Alara as a rival for the Duke of Thornwood's attention. Cordelia had been obsessed with Alaric, and she had seen him watching Alara at a ball months before. She could not bear the thought of him marrying anyone else. The second letter was a note in Alaric's own hand, addressed to a solicitor, outlining his discovery of the plot and his decision to marry Alara immediately to protect her from ruin. "I cannot prove Cordelia's guilt without exposing Agnes to retaliation," he wrote. "But I will not let Alara suffer. Marrying her is the only shield I can offer. She must never know the truth, because if she learns that I married her to save her from a scandal born of my own shadow, she will despise me forever." The papers slipped from Alara's fingers. Her legs gave way, and she sank into his chair, her whole body trembling. He had known. He had known all along, and he had married her not out of cold duty but out of desperate, silent love. He had carried the weight of that secret, the guilt of feeling responsible for her pain, while she had hated his distance. The coldness she had resented was not indifference. It was a man punishing himself for a sin he never committed. She found him in the garden as dusk fell, standing by the same rose trellis where she had laughed with Callum. His back was to her, his shoulders bent in a weariness she had never allowed herself to see. She stepped closer, her voice barely a breath. "Alaric." He turned, and his eyes were red-rimmed, his face etched with a sorrow so deep it stole her breath. She held up the letters. "I found these. I know everything." He closed his eyes, a shudder running through him. "Then you know I have been the architect of your suffering. I should have told you. I should have let you decide. But I was too afraid you would leave. And I was too arrogant to let you see my weakness." She crossed the remaining distance and took his face in her hands. He flinched, as if her touch was more than he deserved. "You were a fool," she said, her voice thick with tears. "But you were a fool who loved me when no one else would. You saved me, and then you shut me out. I have been so angry. I have been so alone. But I see you now, Alaric, I see you." A sob broke from his chest, and he fell to his knees in the grass, his arms wrapping around her waist as if she were the only anchor in a storm. "Forgive me," he whispered into the fabric of her gown. "Please. I will spend every day of my life making you feel seen. I will never let you feel invisible again. I love you. I love you." She knelt with him, her own tears falling freely, and she pressed her forehead to his. "Then show me," she murmured. "Show me from this day forward no more silence, no more distance." He cupped her face, his thumbs brushing away her tears, and for the first time his gaze held no shields, no winter, only a raw, aching tenderness. "I promise," he said, "with everything I am." In the weeks that followed, Thornwood Hall began to change. The corridors no longer felt like a cold museum. Alaric walked with Alara through the estate each morning, his hand resting gently at the small of her back, as if he could not bear to lose contact. He asked her about the village, about the tenants, and he listened. He brought her flowers from the garden, leaving them on her pillow with small notes in his own handwriting, halting, earnest words that spoke of love long denied. She kept every one. One evening, they hosted a small dinner for close friends, and Lady Margaret watched her brother with wide, astonished eyes as he laughed at something Alara said and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek with a tenderness that made the whole table fall silent. Edward Sterling, who had remained a dear friend, raised his glass with a knowing smile. "It is good to see the Duke finally smile," he said. "Thornwood has been waiting for spring." Alara met her husband's gaze, and the warmth in his eyes was a promise fulfilled. That night, as they stood together on the terrace under a canopy of stars, Alaric wrapped his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on her shoulder. "I wasted so much time," he murmured. She turned in his embrace and touched his cheek. "We have the rest of our lives. That is not wasted. That is a gift." He kissed her then, slowly and reverently, as if she were the first breath after drowning. And in the quiet of that healed estate, the Duchess who had once been invisible finally knew what it was to be cherished. She had not just been seen. She had been loved all along, and now, at last, she could feel it.